The notification sound from my phone at 6:47 a.m. should have been my first warning. Credit alert. $8,500 charged to your Visa ending in 2,847. I stared at the screen, still half asleep, thinking it had to be a mistake. I hadn't spent that much money in months, let alone in a single transaction. But when I opened my banking app, there it was. A charge to Bella Vista Gardens wedding venue in Sacramento. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. My hands started shaking as I scrolled through more notifications that had apparently been coming in all night while my phone was on silent. Another $3,200 to Elegant Events Catering. Then $1,800 to Flowers by Design. Each charge felt like a punch to the gut. By the time I finished counting, someone had racked up over $20,000 on my credit cards. The worst part? I had a pretty good idea who was responsible. My name is Rebecca Martinez, and I've always been what people call responsible. While my younger sister Stephanie was busy dreaming about her perfect fairy tale wedding, I was the one building my credit score, saving every penny, and making sure our family stayed afloat financially. At 28, I had worked 2 jobs since college to help pay for Dad's medical bills after his stroke 3 years ago, and I'd been the one covering Mom's prescriptions when her insurance wouldn't. Stephanie, on the other hand, had always been Dad's princess. 5 years younger than me, she'd never worked a full-time job, never paid her own bills, and never seemed to worry about money, because she knew Dad would always find a way to give her whatever she wanted. When she got engaged to her boyfriend Marcus 6 months ago, she immediately started planning what she called the wedding of the century. The problem was, our family didn't have century-level money. Dad drove a 2003 Honda Civic with a broken air conditioner. Mom clipped coupons religiously and bought generic everything. I lived in a tiny studio apartment because it was all I could afford after helping with family expenses. But somehow, in Stephanie's mind, her wedding was going to cost $50,000. I should have seen the warning signs earlier. 3 weeks ago, Dad had asked me about my credit cards during one of our usual Sunday dinners. He seemed casual about it, just wondering how I'd managed to get such good credit and whether the limits were decent. I'd been proud to tell him about my 780 credit score and the fact that I'd been approved for several cards with high limits, something I'd worked years to achieve. "That's wonderful, Mija," he'd said, patting my hand. "You're so smart with money, not like your old dad." I thought he was just proud of me. I should have known better. Dad had always been a dreamer, the kind of man who bought lottery tickets with money we needed for groceries and genuinely believed he'd hit it big someday. After his stroke, he'd become more impulsive, more emotional. The doctors said it was common. Damage to certain parts of the brain could affect judgment and decision-making, but knowing the medical reason didn't make it easier to deal with. When Stephanie announced her engagement, Dad cried, not just a few tears, full-on sobbing about how his little girl was going to have the most beautiful wedding anyone had ever seen. He started making promises immediately. The best venue, the perfect dress, flowers everywhere, a band instead of a DJ. Mom tried to gently suggest they start small, maybe have the reception at the community center, but Dad wouldn't hear it. "My daughter deserves the best," he kept saying. "I don't care what it costs." The thing was, he did care what it costs, because he didn't have the money to pay for it. I found out later that Dad had been calling wedding vendors for weeks, getting quotes and putting deposits down with promises that he'd have the money soon. He'd convinced himself that his disability settlement would come through in time, even though his lawyer had told him repeatedly that these cases take years to resolve. When that didn't pan out, he'd apparently decided that my good credit was the solution to all their problems. The morning I discovered the charges, I immediately called my credit card companies to report fraud. But when I gave them the details, something felt wrong. The customer service representative asked me to hold while she checked something, and when she came back, her tone had changed completely. "Ma'am, I'm showing that these charges were made with your physical credit card, and the signature on the receipts matches what we have on file. Are you saying someone forged your signature?" My blood ran cold. "What do you mean, my physical card?" The card ending in 2847 was used in person at these establishments. The signatures match, and there were no signs of fraud from the merchant's perspective. I ran to my purse and yanked out my wallet. My Visa card was missing. So was my MasterCard and my Discover card. The only thing left was my debit card, which had a much lower daily spending limit. I called Stephanie immediately. "Oh, Rebecca," she answered on the first ring, sounding happier than I'd heard her in months. "I was just about to call you. You won't believe how perfect everything is turning out. The venue is absolutely gorgeous, and the caterer says we can upgrade to the premium menu for just a little more, and—" "Where are my credit cards, Stephanie?" The line went quiet for a long moment. "What?" "My credit cards. They're missing from my wallet, and someone just spent $20,000 on wedding expenses. So I'm going to ask you again, where are my credit cards?" "Rebecca, I don't know what you're talking about." But her voice had changed. The excitement was gone, replaced by something that sounded almost like guilt. "Put Dad on the phone." "He's not here right now," he went to. "Stephanie, I swear to God, if you don't put Dad on the phone right now, I'm calling the police and reporting my cards stolen." Another long pause. Then I heard muffled voices in the background, like she was covering the phone and talking to someone. Finally, Dad's voice came on the line. "Mija, don't be upset. I can explain everything. You took my credit cards. I borrowed them, just temporarily. The settlement money is going to come through any day now, and I'll pay every penny back with interest. Stephanie's wedding is in 6 weeks, and we already put deposits down on everything. If we don't pay the vendors now, she'll lose everything." I felt like I was talking to a stranger. "Dad, you stole my credit cards and spent $20,000 without asking me. Do you understand that's a crime?" "I didn't steal anything. You're my daughter, we're family, I would never hurt you. But Stephanie needs this, Rebecca. This wedding means everything to her, and I promised her it would be perfect. You have good credit, you can handle the payments until I get the settlement. It's all gonna work out." "What if the settlement doesn't come through? What if it takes another 2 years? These are my cards, Dad. My credit score. My financial future. I've worked so hard to build this, and you just—" My voice broke. "How could you do this to me?" "Because I knew you'd say no," he said quietly. "You're always so careful with money, so worried about everything. Sometimes you have to take risks for the people you love. Stephanie is only getting married once, but you'll have plenty of time to fix your credit later." I hung up the phone and sat in my kitchen, staring at the wall. $20,000. That was more than I made in 6 months at my part-time retail job. Even with my full-time office job, it would take me over a year to pay off that kind of debt, assuming I could make more than the minimum payments. The worst part was that Dad genuinely seemed to believe he'd done the right thing. In his mind, he was being a good father by making sure Stephanie got her dream wedding. He'd convinced himself that the settlement money would solve everything, that I'd thank him later for helping make his daughter's dreams come true. But dreams don't pay credit card bills, and I was the one who was going to be stuck with the nightmare. I drove straight to my parents' house in Riverside, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles had gone white. The 30-minute drive gave me time to think, and the more I thought, the angrier I became. This wasn't just about money. This was about trust, respect, and the fact that my own father had essentially stolen my identity to fund my sister's fantasies. When I pulled into the driveway, I could see Stephanie's car parked behind Dad's Honda. Perfect. I wanted to deal with both of them at once. Mom answered the door, and I could tell immediately that she knew something was wrong. Her face had that pinched, worried look she got whenever there was family drama, and she wouldn't quite meet my eyes. "Rebecca, honey, maybe you should calm down before—" "Where are they, Mom?" "In the kitchen." "But sweetheart, your father didn't mean any harm. He's just trying to make Stephanie happy, and you know how he gets when—" I walked past her into the kitchen, where Dad and Stephanie were sitting at the table with what looked like wedding planning materials spread everywhere. Brochures, color swatches, printed emails from vendors. My credit cards were sitting right there on the table next to a notebook where someone had been writing down numbers. "Give me my cards," I said. Dad looked up with this hopeful expression, like maybe I'd come over to tell him everything was fine. "Misha, I'm so glad you're here. We need to talk about the flowers. The florist says if we order 2 more centerpieces, we get a discount that actually saves money in the long run. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. Dad, give me my credit cards right now. Stephanie finally spoke up. Rebecca, you're being really dramatic about this. Dad explained everything. The settlement money is coming, and you'll get paid back with interest. This is my wedding we're talking about. Don't you want me to be happy? I stared at her, this 23-year-old woman who had never paid her own cell phone bill, sitting there acting like I was the unreasonable one for being upset about credit card fraud. Stephanie, do you have any idea what you've done? Do you understand that this debt is in my name? If Dad doesn't pay it back, which, by the way, he can't because he doesn't have the money, I'm the one whose credit gets destroyed. I'm the one who gets sued by the credit card companies. I'm the one whose wages get garnished. That's not going to happen, Dad said firmly. The settlement. There is no settlement, I shouted, losing my temper completely. Dad, your lawyer told you it could take years, if it happens at all. You're living in a fantasy world, and you're dragging me down with you. Mom had followed me into the kitchen and was hovering nervously by the doorway. Rebecca, please don't yell at your father. You know his blood pressure. His blood pressure? What about my blood pressure? What about my life? I grabbed my credit cards off the table and shoved them into my purse. Do you people have any idea what I've sacrificed for this family? I've been working 2 jobs for 3 years to help pay Dad's medical bills. I live in a studio apartment that's smaller than most people's closets because I send you money every month. I haven't taken a real vacation since college because I'm too busy making sure everyone else is okay. We know you help out and we're grateful, Stephanie said, but her tone suggested she thought I was being overdramatic. But this is different. This is my wedding, Rebecca. It's supposed to be the most important day of my life. And what about my life? What happens when I can't get approved for a car loan because my credit is ruined? What happens when I can't rent a decent apartment or buy a house someday because I have $20,000 in debt that I didn't even choose to take on? Dad stood up from the table, and I could see he was getting emotional. You think I wanted this? You think I wanted to have to ask my daughter for help? I hate that I can't provide for my family the way I used to. But Stephanie deserves a beautiful wedding, and if I don't give it to her, she'll regret it for the rest of her life. So instead, I should regret it for the rest of mine? It's not going to be for the rest of your life. The settlement money? Stop talking about the settlement money. I was screaming now, something I never did. But I felt like I was talking to people who lived on a different planet. Even if, and that's a huge if, even if you get a settlement, it's not going to be tomorrow. It's not going to be next month. These credit card bills are due in 30 days, Dad. Every month, with interest. Do you know what the interest rate is on $20,000 of credit card debt? I pulled out my phone and opened the calculator app. Let's say the average interest rate is 22%. If I make minimum payments on $20,000, do you know how long it will take me to pay it off? 18 years. And do you know how much I'll end up paying total? Almost $50,000. The kitchen went completely silent. I could see the numbers were finally starting to sink in, at least for Mom. That can't be right, Stephanie said quietly. It's exactly right. You can look it up yourself. $20,000 in credit card debt at 22% interest, making minimum payments, costs almost $50,000 over 18 years. That's assuming I never miss a payment, never get charged late fees, and never have any other financial emergencies. Dad sat back down heavily. I didn't know the interest was that high. Of course you didn't know because you didn't bother to ask me before you stole my cards and started spending my money. I didn't steal. You took my credit cards without permission and used them to make purchases. That's literally the definition of theft, Dad. If a stranger had done this, I would have called the police immediately. Mom finally spoke up from the doorway. What do you want us to do, Rebecca? The deposits are already paid. If we cancel everything now, we lose the money anyway. I turned to look at her. We? Mom, there is no we in this situation. This is my debt. My name is on these credit cards. If Stephanie wants to get married, She and Marcus need to figure out how to pay for their own wedding, like every other adult couple in the world. But the venue is already booked, Stephanie said, and I could hear her voice starting to shake. The invitations went out 2 weeks ago. Everyone's expecting. Then maybe you should have made sure you could actually afford it before you started booking venues and sending invitations. Stephanie burst into tears. You're ruining my wedding. This is supposed to be the happiest time of my life, and you're being so selfish. I'm being selfish? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Stephanie, you and Dad committed fraud using my identity, and I'm the one being selfish? We're family, she sobbed. Family is supposed to help each other. Help is when someone asks for assistance and you choose to give it. This is theft. There's a difference. I looked around the kitchen at my family, Dad looking defeated, Mom wringing her hands nervously, Stephanie crying into her hands, and I realized that none of them were going to take responsibility for what they'd done. They genuinely believed that because we were related, my money was somehow their money, my credit was their credit. My future was expendable for Stephanie's wedding day. I'm leaving, I said. And when I get home, I'm calling every single one of my credit card companies to freeze the accounts and report unauthorized use. Rebecca, wait, Dad started. No, I'm done waiting. I'm done being the responsible one who cleans up everyone else's messes. You want Stephanie to have her dream wedding? Find another way to pay for it. I walked out of that house knowing I was about to start a war with my own family. But for the first time in years, I felt like I was finally fighting for myself. The drive home was a blur of anger and determination. By the time I reached my studio apartment, I had a plan. I wasn't going to let my family destroy my financial future, even if it meant destroying my relationship with them. I spread all my credit card statements across my tiny dining table and started making calls. The first company was Visa. I need to report unauthorized use of my credit card and freeze the account immediately. I can help you with that, ma'am. Can you tell me about the unauthorized charges? Someone used my physical card to make several large purchases totaling over $8,000. The charges are to wedding vendors in Sacramento. The representative walked me through the fraud reporting process. Since the charges were made with my physical card and the signatures appeared to match, they would need to investigate. In the meantime, they could freeze the account to prevent additional charges. We'll need you to file a police report for the stolen card, she explained. Once you have the report number, we can expedite the fraud investigation. A police report. That meant officially reporting my father for theft. My hands were shaking as I hung up and dialed the next credit card company. The conversation with MasterCard was similar, and so was the one with Discover. Within an hour, all 3 accounts were frozen, and I had instructions to file police reports for each stolen card. The representatives were professional and helpful, but I could hear the judgment in their voices. Family fraud was messier than stranger fraud, and everyone knew it. My phone started ringing before I'd even finished the 3rd call. Rebecca, what did you do? It was Stephanie, and she sounded panicked. The florist just called and said my card was declined. She's threatening to cancel our flower order. I froze the accounts. You can't do that. The wedding is in 5 weeks. We have final payments due on everything. Then you and Marcus better figure out how to pay for them with your own money. We don't have that kind of money. You know we don't. Rebecca, please, you have to unfreeze the cards. I'm begging you. I closed my eyes and tried to stay calm. Stephanie, those aren't your cards. They never were. You don't get to spend my money just because Dad decided to steal my identity. It's not stealing. We're family. Family members don't commit fraud against each other, Stephanie. Normal family members ask for help and accept it when the answer is no. She was crying again. But what am I supposed to do? The wedding is already planned. Everyone's expecting. Have a smaller wedding. Go to City Hall. Have the reception at Mom and Dad's house. Do what millions of people do when they can't afford a $50,000 party. You don't understand. This isn't just any wedding. This is my dream. I've been planning this since I was little. The venue, the dress, the flowers, everything has to be perfect. And I've been dreaming of buying a house someday, but I guess my dreams don't matter as much as your one-day party. That's not fair. What's not fair is that Dad stole my credit cards and you're acting like I'm the bad guy for reporting it. The line went quiet for a moment, and when Stephanie spoke again, her voice was different, calculating instead of emotional. "Fine. If you won't help your own sister, then I guess we'll just have to find another way." She hung up, and something about her tone made me nervous. I had a feeling this wasn't over. I was right. An hour later, my phone rang again. This time it was Mom. "Rebecca, honey, you need to come back over here. Your father is very upset, and I'm worried about his health." "Is he having chest pains?" "No, but he's been pacing around the house saying he's a terrible father and that he's let everyone down. You know how he gets when he's stressed." The doctor said, "Mom, stop. Dad is not going to have a heart attack because I reported credit card fraud. He's upset because he got caught doing something wrong, not because he's having a medical emergency." "How can you be so cold? This is your father we're talking about." "This is my father who stole my credit cards and spent $20,000 without asking me. Mom, do you understand that I could press criminal charges? Do you understand that Dad could go to jail for what he did?" There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. "You wouldn't." "I'm filing police reports this afternoon. The credit card companies require it for the fraud investigation." "Rebecca, please. I know you're angry, but think about what this would do to our family. Think about Stephanie. She's already called off work for the rest of the week because she's so distraught. She called off work because her free ride just ended. That's cruel. What's cruel is stealing someone's identity and then acting like they're the problem for being upset about it." Mom was quiet for a long moment. "What if we could work something out? What if Dad signed something promising to pay you back by a certain date?" "With what money, Mom?" "Dad gets disability payments that barely cover his own expenses. You work part-time at the grocery store. Stephanie makes minimum wage at the boutique when she bothers to show up. Where exactly is this magical repayment money going to come from? The settlement is imaginary. Mom, even Dad's lawyer told him not to count on it. You can't build financial plans around money that might never exist. So that's it. You're just going to destroy your sister's wedding and probably send your father to jail because you care more about money than family?" I felt like I was losing my mind. "I care more about not being financially ruined by people who are supposed to love me. Mom, if I let this slide, what's to stop them from doing it again? What's to stop Dad from deciding I should pay for Stephanie's honeymoon, or her first house, or her kids' college funds?" "Your father would never." "Dad already did something I never thought he would do. I can't trust any of you anymore." I hung up before she could respond and immediately called the non-emergency line for the local police department. Filing the reports was easier than I'd expected. Apparently, family financial fraud was more common than I'd realized. "Unfortunately, we see this a lot," the officer explained as he took my statement. "Parents using their adult children's credit, siblings stealing identity information. It's hard to prosecute because victims often don't want to press charges against family members." "I want to press charges." He looked up from his paperwork. "Are you sure? Once we start the investigation, it's difficult to stop the process. Your father could face felony charges depending on the amount involved." $20,000 was definitely felony territory. But I thought about Stephanie's calculating tone on the phone, about Dad's complete lack of remorse, about Mom trying to guilt me into accepting financial ruin for the sake of family peace. I'm sure. After finishing at the police station, I drove to my office job at the insurance company where I worked as a claims processor. I'd been there for 4 years, and my supervisor, Janet Morrison, had always been supportive. I knocked on her office door and asked if I could speak privately. "I'm having some family issues that might affect my work," I explained. "Someone stole my credit cards and ran up a lot of debt, and I'm dealing with fraud investigations and police reports." Janet looked concerned. "That sounds terrible. Is there anything the company can do to help? I might need to take some time off for meetings with investigators or court appearances. And honestly, I'm pretty stressed right now, so if my focus seems off, that's why. Take whatever time you need. We have good employee assistance programs if you need counseling or legal advice." It was the first supportive response I'd gotten all day, and I almost cried right there in her office. By the time I got home that evening, I had 3 voicemails from Stephanie, 2 from Mom and 1 from a number I didn't recognize. The unknown number turned out to be Marcus, Stephanie's fiancé. Rebecca, this is Marcus. I think we need to talk. This whole situation has gotten out of hand, and I have some ideas about how we can fix it. Call me back. I deleted the message without calling him back. I was done being the family's solution to problems they'd created themselves. The next morning brought a surprise I wasn't prepared for. Marcus was standing outside my apartment building at 7 a.m., holding 2 cups of coffee and looking like he hadn't slept all night. "We need to talk," he said when I opened the door. "And before you slam this door in my face, I'm not here to defend what your dad did. I'm here because I think there's something you don't know about this whole situation." Against my better judgment, I let him in. Marcus had always seemed like a decent guy. Quiet, hardworking, nothing like the flashy type Stephanie usually dated. He worked as an electrician and seemed genuinely in love with my sister, despite her high-maintenance tendencies. "Look," he said, settling into my only chair while I perched on the edge of my bed, "I had no idea your dad was using your credit cards. Stephanie told me her family was paying for the wedding, and I assumed that meant they had saved up for it or something. You never questioned how a disabled man and a part-time grocery store clerk could afford a $50,000 wedding?" Marcus ran his hands through his hair. "Honestly? I tried to talk Stephanie into something smaller from the beginning. I suggested we pay for it ourselves, maybe have a simple ceremony and a backyard reception. But she said her dad insisted on paying for everything, that it was really important to him to give her the wedding she'd always dreamed of. So you just went along with it. I thought I was being respectful of her family's wishes. My parents are divorced and not very involved, so I figured maybe this was how close families handled weddings." He paused. I realize now how stupid that sounds. I studied his face, trying to figure out if this was another manipulation attempt. But Marcus looked genuinely distressed, not angry or accusatory like the rest of my family. "What exactly did Stephanie tell you about the money?" "She said your dad had been saving for years and that he'd gotten some kind of settlement or insurance payout. When I asked her about specifics, she always changed the subject or said her dad didn't like to talk about money stuff." "Did you ever meet with any of the vendors yourself?" Marcus shook his head. "Stephanie handled all of that. She said she enjoyed the planning process and wanted to surprise me with how beautiful everything would be. I just showed up for the cake tasting and the final menu selection." I felt a cold realization settling in my stomach. "Marcus, I don't think Stephanie was as innocent in this as she's pretending to be." "What do you mean?" "Think about it, she's been engaged for 6 months. She's been planning this wedding for 6 months. Do you really think she never questioned where the money was coming from? Do you think she never noticed that Dad doesn't have $50,000 lying around?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "She did seem to know a lot about your financial situation. She mentioned once that you had really good credit and that you were smart with money." "When did she say that?" "Maybe 2 months ago. We were talking about getting our own place after the wedding, and I was worried about qualifying for a lease because my credit isn't great. She said not to worry because you had amazing credit and could probably co-sign for us if we needed it." The pieces were starting to come together, and I didn't like the picture they were forming. "Marcus, did Stephanie ever ask you about your credit cards? Or mention anything about borrowing money?" "Actually, yeah. A few weeks ago she asked if I had any credit cards with high limits. I told her I had one with about $3,000 available, and she asked if she could use it for some last-minute wedding expenses. But then she said never mind, that her dad had it handled. She was shopping for credit lines. She probably started with you, realized $3,000 wasn't enough, and then convinced Dad to steal mine." Marcus looked sick. "You think she planned this?" "I think Stephanie wanted her dream wedding more than she cared about the consequences. And I think she convinced Dad to do the dirty work so she could claim innocence if it all went wrong." We sat in silence for a while, both processing what this meant. Finally, Marcus spoke again. "What happens now, with the police reports and everything?" "The credit card companies are investigating. If they determine it was fraud, they'll reverse the charges and go after Dad for the money. If he can't pay, which he can't, they'll probably sue him or press criminal charges. And if Stephanie was involved? Then she's an accessory to credit card fraud and identity theft." Marcus put his head in his hands. "This is such a mess. I love Stephanie, but I can't marry someone who would do something like this. What kind of person steals from their own sister? The kind of person who thinks the world revolves around them and everyone else exists to make their dreams come true. He looked up at me with something like desperation in his eyes. Is there any way to fix this? Any way to make this right without destroying everyone? I had been asking myself the same question since this whole nightmare started. Not unless someone comes up with $20,000 in the next few weeks. And even then, the damage to our family is probably permanent. What if I called off the wedding? That surprised me. You'd do that? Rebecca, I can't start a marriage built on fraud. And honestly, seeing how Stephanie has handled this whole situation, how she's blamed you for everything instead of taking responsibility? He shrugged. Maybe I don't know her as well as I thought I did. That's a decision you have to make for yourself. But Marcus, if you're thinking about calling it off because you feel guilty about the money, don't. You didn't know what was happening. Maybe not consciously. But I should have asked more questions. I should have insisted on being more involved in the planning. I let myself be willfully ignorant because it was easier. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. We need to meet. Important info about Stephanie and the wedding expenses. Come to Starbucks on 5th Street at 3 p.m. C. I showed the message to Marcus. Do you know anyone with the initial C? He shook his head. But you should probably go. If someone else has information about this situation, it might be important for your investigation. After Marcus left, I spent the rest of the morning at my insurance job, trying to focus on processing claims, while my personal life fell apart around me. Janet stopped by my desk around lunchtime to check on me. How are you holding up? About as well as you'd expect from someone whose family committed identity theft. She lowered her voice. I don't want to overstep, but I've been through something similar. My ex-husband opened credit cards in my name during our divorce. If you need someone to talk to who understands the legal and financial aspects of this kind of situation, I'm here. It was the first time in days that someone had offered help without expecting anything in return. Thank you, I might take you up on that. At 3 p.m., I walked into the Starbucks on 5th Street, nervous about who I was meeting and what they might know. I spotted someone waving at me from a corner table, a woman about my age with short blonde hair and a professional-looking outfit. Rebecca, I'm Claire Henderson. I work at Bella Vista Gardens, the wedding venue where your sister booked her reception. I sat down across from her, confused. How did you get my number? From the credit card information on file. Look, I probably shouldn't be telling you this, but I thought you should know what really happened when the deposits were paid. Claire pulled out her phone and scrolled through what looked like text messages. Your sister came in with your father about 3 weeks ago for the final walkthrough. When it came time to pay the balance, your father seemed confused about the payment method. He kept looking at your sister for guidance. What kind of guidance? She told him which card to use and walked him through signing the receipt. She even corrected him when he started to sign his own name instead of yours. My blood went cold. She coached him through forging my signature? It gets worse. After they left, I realized your father had left his jacket behind. When I ran after them to return it, I heard your sister on the phone with someone, maybe another vendor, giving them your credit card information and telling them it was okay to charge it because you were family. I stared at Claire, feeling like the ground had shifted beneath me. Are you willing to testify to that if this goes to court? She nodded. That's why I'm here. What your sister did was fraud, and I've seen too many families destroyed by wedding debt to let this slide. I have security footage of the whole interaction if you need it. I walked out of that Starbucks knowing that Stephanie wasn't just complicit in Dad's actions. She was the mastermind behind them. Armed with Claire's testimony and the security footage, I drove straight to the police station. Detective Sarah Kim, who had taken my initial report, listened carefully as I explained the new evidence. This changes everything, she said, reviewing Claire's statement. What we initially thought was a case of a confused father taking advantage of his daughter's credit is now looking like a coordinated conspiracy involving your sister as the primary instigator. Can you arrest her? We'll need to interview both your father and sister separately, and we'll want to examine this security footage. But yes, if the evidence supports what this witness is claiming, your sister could face multiple felony charges. Detective Kim paused, studying my face. I have to ask, are you prepared for the full consequences of this investigation? We're potentially talking about both your father and sister facing serious criminal charges. I thought about Stephanie coaching Dad through forging my signature, about her calling other vendors with my credit card information, about the way she'd tried to manipulate me into thinking this was all Dad's confused mistake. I'm prepared. There's something else you should know. We've been in contact with the credit card companies, and they've identified additional charges that weren't in your original report. It looks like your cards were used at several other wedding vendors over the past 2 weeks. My stomach dropped. How much more? Another $12,000. Hair and makeup services, a photographer, a DJ, rental equipment for decorations, all charged after your initial discovery. That's impossible. I froze the accounts the day I found out. Detective Kim checked her notes. These charges were made using the card numbers over the phone, not with the physical cards. Your sister apparently memorized the numbers and continued making purchases even after you froze the accounts for in-person use. $32,000. While I was filing police reports and trying to protect myself, Stephanie had been racking up even more debt in my name. The betrayal felt like a physical blow. We'll need you to file an additional report for these new charges, Detective Kim continued. And frankly, this pattern of behavior is going to make the prosecution's case much stronger. It shows ongoing intent to defraud, not just a one-time mistake. I spent another hour at the police station, documenting the additional fraud and providing Detective Kim with Marcus's contact information as a potential witness. By the time I got home, I felt emotionally drained but strangely relieved. For the first time since this nightmare started, I felt like someone was taking my side. That feeling lasted exactly until I checked my voicemail. Rebecca, this is your Aunt Linda. I just got off the phone with your mother, and I am absolutely disgusted by your behavior. Your father made a mistake, yes, but to have your own family arrested? To destroy your sister's wedding out of spite? I've known you since you were born, and I never thought you could be so vindictive. You need to drop these charges immediately and find a way to work this out like adults. Family doesn't destroy family over money. The next message was from my cousin Tony. Hey Rebecca, Mom told me what's going on. Look, I get that you're upset, but this is getting out of hand. Dad and I could probably lend you guys some money to help sort this out. But you've got to stop with the police stuff. It's making the whole family look bad. There were 6 more messages, all from various relatives who had apparently been recruited by Mom to pressure me into dropping the charges. Each one made me feel more isolated and more convinced that I was surrounded by people who fundamentally didn't understand right from wrong. The last message was from Stephanie herself, and her tone was completely different from our previous conversations. Rebecca, I know you think you're teaching us some kind of lesson, but you're about to ruin multiple lives over money that you'll probably get back anyway from the credit card companies. Dad's health is getting worse from the stress, Mom is having panic attacks, and I've had to tell Marcus that our wedding might not happen because my own sister is trying to send me to jail. Is this really who you want to be? The person who destroys her family because she cares more about her precious credit score than the people who love her? Call me. We can fix this if you stop being so stubborn. I saved the message. Detective Kim had mentioned that any attempts at intimidation or manipulation could be relevant to the case. My phone rang as I was heating up a frozen dinner. Marcus. I did it, he said, without preamble. I called off the wedding. How did Stephanie take it? About as well as you'd expect. She screamed, she cried, she threw things. She called me every name in the book and said it was all your fault for filling my head with lies. I'm sorry, Marcus, I know you cared about her. I did, but I can't marry someone who's capable of what she did to you, and honestly, the way she reacted when I confronted her about the credit card fraud told me everything I needed to know about who she really is. What did she say? She didn't deny it. She just got angry that I was taking your side instead of supporting her. She said you were jealous of her happiness and that you'd always been controlling about money. She actually said, and I quote, Rebecca can afford it, she just doesn't want to share. As if $20,000 is pocket change. $32,000 actually. I called Detective Kim myself and told her about the conversations I'd had with Stephanie about borrowing credit. Turns out, Stephanie had been pumping me for information about your finances for months. She knew exactly how much credit you had available and which cards had the highest limits. I felt a chill run down my spine. She planned this from the beginning. It looks that way. Detective Kim thinks Stephanie spent weeks figuring out how to access your cards and convincing your dad to go along with it. The whole, quote, confused father making a mistake narrative was just cover for a calculated crime. After I hung up with Marcus, I sat in my tiny apartment, thinking about the family I'd grown up in versus the family I was dealing with now. Had Stephanie always been this manipulative, and I'd just been too close to see it? Had Dad always been this willing to hurt one daughter to benefit the other? Had Mom always been this ready to sacrifice me for the sake of family peace? Or had something fundamental shifted when Dad got sick and money became tighter? Maybe desperation had revealed character flaws that had always been there, lurking beneath the surface. My laptop chimed with an email notification. It was from Claire at the wedding venue. "Rebecca, I wanted to let you know that your sister came by the venue today with a man I didn't recognize. They were asking about transferring the booking to different credit cards and whether we could reverse the charges to your cards if they paid cash for the balance. When I told them that wasn't possible because of the fraud investigation, your sister became very hostile. She said you were lying about not authorizing the charges and that this was all a misunderstanding that had gotten blown out of proportion. I thought you should know that she's still trying to find ways around the frozen accounts. I've documented everything and will be sharing it with the police. I'm sorry your family put you in this position." So even after Marcus called off the wedding, even after being confronted with evidence of her fraud, Stephanie was still trying to salvage her dream wedding. She was still looking for ways to spend money she didn't have, still trying to manipulate the situation to her advantage. I realized then that this wasn't going to end with apologies or family reconciliation. Stephanie wasn't going to suddenly develop a conscience and take responsibility for what she'd done. Dad wasn't going to acknowledge that his actions had been wrong. Mom wasn't going to stop trying to guilt me into accepting financial ruin for the sake of family harmony. This was going to end in court, with criminal charges and probably years of family estrangement. But for the first time since this whole mess started, I was okay with that outcome. Because I'd finally learned the difference between being part of a loving family and being the victim of people who happened to share my DNA. 3 months later, I sat in a courtroom watching my father and sister being sentenced for identity theft and credit card fraud. The proceedings had been swift once Detective Kim presented all the evidence. The security footage of Stephanie coaching Dad through forging my signature, the phone records showing her calling vendors with my credit information, and testimony from Marcus about her months-long information gathering about my finances. Dad received 2 years probation and community service, along with a requirement to pay restitution. The judge was lenient because of his medical condition and the fact that he'd been manipulated by Stephanie. My sister wasn't so lucky. She received 18 months in county jail and 5 years probation. The judge made it clear that her role as the mastermind behind the scheme, combined with her attempts to continue the fraud even after being caught, warranted serious consequences. The defendant showed a calculated disregard for her sister's financial well-being, Judge Patricia Wells stated during sentencing. This wasn't a moment of poor judgment, but a sustained campaign of deception and theft that continued even after the victim discovered the fraud. Stephanie turned to look at me as the bailiff led her away in handcuffs. The expression on her face wasn't remorse or sadness. It was pure hatred. Even now, even after everything, she saw me as the villain in her story. Mom hadn't spoken to me since the arrest 3 months ago. She'd moved out of the family house temporarily to stay with Aunt Linda, unable to bear living with Dad while he awaited sentencing. The extended family had split into camps, those who thought I'd done the right thing by pressing charges, and those who believed I'd destroyed the family over money. Uncle Rick had surprised me by calling 2 weeks after the arrest. "I wanted you to know that not everyone thinks you're the bad guy here," he'd said. "What Tom and Stephanie did was wrong, and you had every right to protect yourself. I'm proud of you for standing up for yourself, even when it was hard." His support had meant more to me than I'd expected. For months, I'd felt like I was completely alone in thinking that identity theft was wrong, regardless of family relationships. The credit card companies had reversed all the fraudulent charges after the criminal convictions, which meant I was no longer on the hook for the $32,000. My credit score had taken a temporary hit during the investigation, but it was already recovering. More importantly, I'd learned to protect my financial information in ways I'd never thought necessary before, like getting a safety deposit box for important documents and setting up fraud alerts on all my accounts. Marcus had stayed in touch throughout the legal proceedings. He'd testified for the prosecution, providing crucial evidence about Stephanie's premeditation and planning. The experience had been difficult for him, watching the woman he'd planned to marry get convicted of felony fraud, but he'd handled it with more grace than I'd expected. "I keep thinking about what would have happened if we'd actually gotten married," he told me over coffee a week after the sentencing. "Would she have eventually used my credit cards too? Would she have taught our kids that stealing from family was acceptable as long as you had a good reason? You're better off finding out who she really was before you legally tied your life to hers." I know. It just makes me wonder how many other red flags I ignored because I was in love with the idea of her rather than the reality. Marcus had started dating someone new, a teacher named Amy who worked with special needs kids and lived within her means. From what he'd told me, she was the complete opposite of Stephanie in all the best ways. My own life had changed in unexpected ways too. Janet, my supervisor at the insurance company, had been so impressed with how I'd handled the legal proceedings that she'd recommended me for a promotion to senior claims investigator. The new position came with a significant raise and better benefits, which meant I could finally afford to move out of my studio apartment. I'd found a one-bedroom place in a better neighborhood, with actual closet space and a kitchen big enough for a real dining table. For the first time in my adult life, I was living somewhere that felt like home, rather than just a place to sleep between work shifts. The promotion had also given me insight into how common family financial fraud actually was. In my new role investigating insurance fraud, I regularly saw cases of parents stealing from adult children, siblings forging signatures on policies, and spouses hiding debts from each other. What had felt like a uniquely horrible betrayal was actually depressingly common. But knowing I wasn't alone in the experience had helped me process what had happened. I'd started seeing a therapist who specialized in family trauma, and she'd helped me understand that my decision to press charges wasn't about money. It was about refusing to accept being victimized by people who claimed to love me. Setting boundaries with family members who have boundary issues often feels cruel, Dr. Martinez had explained during one of our sessions. But enabling destructive behavior isn't actually kind. It's just easier in the short term. The hardest part had been accepting that my relationship with my parents might never recover. Dad had written me several letters from home during his probation, apologizing for his actions and begging me to forgive him. But his letters always included justifications: stress from his medical condition, manipulation by Stephanie, desperation to be a good father. He seemed genuinely sorry that he'd been caught, but I wasn't convinced he understood why what he'd done was fundamentally wrong. Mom's silence was almost worse than Dad's conditional apologies. She'd made her choice to support Stephanie and Dad over me, and apparently that choice was final. Part of me had hoped that seeing Stephanie get convicted would open Mom's eyes to who was really at fault, but it seemed to have had the opposite effect. Now, I wasn't just the daughter who'd refused to help with the wedding, I was the daughter who'd sent her sister to jail. The wedding date that Stephanie had been so desperate to preserve came and went without ceremony. The venue had kept the deposit as compensation for the fraud investigation disruption, and most of the other vendors had similar policies. Even if Stephanie had found another way to pay for everything, the legal proceedings would have made it impossible to hold the event as planned. I'd heard through the family grapevine that Stephanie was planning to have a small ceremony after her release, probably at City Hall with dinner at a restaurant afterward. The irony wasn't lost on me. She could have had that exact wedding from the beginning without committing fraud or destroying our family. 6 months after the sentencing, I received an unexpected visitor at my new apartment. It was Mom, looking older and more tired than I'd ever seen her. "Can I come in?" she asked quietly. I stepped aside to let her in, unsure of what to expect. We hadn't spoken since before the arrest, and our last conversation had ended with her accusing me of being vindictive and cruel. She looked around my apartment, the new furniture I'd been able to afford with my promotion, the framed pictures on the walls, the plants I'd started keeping now that I had windows with decent light. "You've done well for yourself," she said finally. "I've been working hard." "I know you have. You've always been the responsible one." Mom sat down heavily on my couch. I owe you an apology, Rebecca, a big one. I remained standing, not sure I was ready to trust this conversation. I've been angry at you for months, she continued. Angry that you pressed charges. Angry that you wouldn't just work it out as a family. Angry that you sent Stephanie to jail. But your father's been going to counseling as part of his probation, and some of the things he's learned, some of the things the counselor has made us both realize. She paused, struggling with the words. We enabled Stephanie her whole life. We taught her that her wants were more important than other people's needs. We taught her that family means never having to face consequences for hurting the people who love you. And when she stole from you, our first instinct was to protect her from the consequences, rather than acknowledge what she'd done to you. I sat down across from her, still cautious but willing to listen. The counselor asked us to imagine if a stranger had done to you what Stephanie did. If some random person had stolen your credit cards and racked up $30,000 in debt in your name, we would have wanted them prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. We would have been outraged on your behalf. But because it was Stephanie, I was supposed to just accept it. Because it was Stephanie, we expected you to sacrifice your financial future to protect her from her own choices. And that wasn't fair to you. It was never fair to you. Mom was crying now, something I'd rarely seen her do. I'm so sorry, Rebecca. I'm sorry we put you in that position. I'm sorry we made you choose between your family and your own well-being. And I'm sorry it took me 6 months to realize that you made the only choice you could make. We talked for 3 hours that afternoon. Mom told me about the family counseling sessions she and Dad had been attending, about coming to terms with the ways they'd failed both their daughters, spoiling Stephanie to the point where she felt entitled to anything she wanted, and taking me for granted because I was responsible and didn't demand constant attention. I used to think your independence was a good thing, Mom said. I was proud that you could take care of yourself, that you didn't need us the way Stephanie did. But I realize now that everyone needs support, and we just assumed you didn't because you never asked for it. I stopped asking because the answer was always that you couldn't help because you were too busy helping Stephanie. I know, and I know that saying sorry doesn't undo years of that pattern. But I want to try to do better if you'll let me. It wasn't a magic fix. 6 months of hurt and betrayal couldn't be erased with one conversation, but it was a start. Mom began visiting regularly, and we slowly rebuilt a relationship based on mutual respect rather than family obligation. Dad's recovery was slower and more complicated. He struggled with accepting responsibility for his actions without blaming his medical condition or Stephanie's manipulation. But gradually, through continued counseling and probation check-ins, he began to understand the impact his choices had had on my life. I thought being a good father meant giving my daughters whatever they wanted, he told me during one of our carefully supervised visits. I didn't understand that sometimes being a good father means saying no, even when it breaks your heart. Stephanie, on the other hand, never showed any remorse. The few letters she sent from jail were full of self-pity and blame. Blame for me, for Marcus, for the justice system, for anyone except herself. She'd convinced herself that she was the victim of a cruel system that didn't understand how important her wedding had been. She was released after serving 11 months of her sentence, and I heard she'd moved to another state to start fresh. We haven't spoken since her sentencing, and I don't expect we ever will again. Some relationships can't survive the revelation of fundamental character differences. A year after everything happened, I ran into Claire from the wedding venue at a coffee shop. She told me that my case had prompted them to implement new policies about payment verification and fraud prevention. You probably saved other families from going through what you went through, she said. When people hear about your case, they understand why we have to be so careful about payment authorization now. It was a small comfort, knowing that something positive had come from my family's destruction. Marcus and Amy got engaged 6 months later. They had a small, affordable ceremony in Amy's parents' backyard, with homemade decorations and a potluck reception. It was everything Stephanie's planned wedding wasn't genuine, joyful, and within their means. Thank you, Marcus told me at their reception. If you hadn't stood up for yourself, I might have married into a family that thought fraud was acceptable. Amy and I are building our marriage on honesty and responsibility, and part of that is because of what I learned from watching you handle this situation. As I write this, it's been 2 years since I froze my credit cards and discovered that my own family had been systematically stealing from me. My relationship with Mom has continued to improve, and Dad and I exchange occasional emails, though we're not close the way we used to be. I've heard through mutual acquaintances that Stephanie is working at a retail store in Phoenix and living with a roommate, but we've had no direct contact. I still work in fraud investigation, and I've become something of an expert on family financial crimes. I speak at seminars occasionally, helping other people understand their rights and options when family members violate their financial boundaries. The most important thing I've learned is that family isn't about DNA or shared history. It's about mutual respect, support, and accountability. People who truly love you don't steal from you and then make you feel guilty for being upset about it. People who truly care about your well-being don't sacrifice your future for their immediate wants. I have a smaller family now, but it's a healthier one. And I've learned to build chosen family with friends and colleagues who share my values and treat me with the respect I deserve. Sometimes people ask me if I regret pressing charges against my father and sister. The answer is always no. I regret that they put me in a position where I had to choose between my financial future and family harmony. I regret that they made choices that destroyed our relationships, but I don't regret protecting myself from people who were willing to hurt me for their own benefit. Setting boundaries isn't cruel, even when it feels like it. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable destructive behavior, even when that refusal costs you relationships you thought were permanent. I froze those credit cards to protect myself from fraud. I had no idea I was also freezing out people who had never truly respected me as a person. In the end, that turned out to be the most valuable thing I could have done for my own well-being. My credit score is excellent now. More importantly, my self-respect is intact. And that's worth more than any wedding, no matter how perfect it might have been. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.